Henry VIII is perhaps history's most famous king, not just of England, but ever. He ruled from 1509, when he was 17, until his death at the age of 55 in 1547. Now, what's he famous for? A few things: composing music, marrying 6 wives, executing 2 of them. Oh yes, and basically initiating the Reformation, which almost completely changed England's religion, turning it from a Catholic kingdom into a Protestant one, and in turn creating the Church of England and declaring himself a kind of rival to the Pope himself as head of it. And all because he'd got himself a new girlfriend that he wanted to marry. Anyway, let's have a look at where he sits in our timeline. He's here, his reign ending just over 470 years ago. When he was born in 1491, his father, Henry VII, had been on the English throne for about 6 years. I'm kind of losing count of the number of times I've started one of these Kings and Queens videos by saying the following, but here we go again. Just like his father, and Kings Henry I, Stephen, John, Henry IV, Edward IV, and Richard III before him, when he was born, no one held him up and declared, "Gentleman, the future King of England." In Henry's case, this is because his father already had a son and heir, Arthur, who would be raised as the next king of the realm. In fact, because Henry was a spare, he wasn't trained as a king. Instead, he was given a pretty rounded education. This is demonstrated by the fact that he spoke Latin and French fluently. He also loved and wrote poetry and music, and just look at his beautiful cursive writing shown here in his signature. Hus for verti XS. When he was 10, his 15-year-old brother Arthur married Catherine of Aragon. King Henry VII saw it as a way to tie England and Spain into an alliance against their common enemy, France, of course. 5 months later, however, Arthur died unexpectedly. Suddenly, the kingdom was thrown into a crisis, and Henry VII was drowning in grief for his lost son. It must have come as a shock to the young Henry. He'd been lined up for a role in the clergy. Now he would be the undisputed king one day. Henry VII, keen to maintain his alliance with Spain, signed a treaty promising Henry would marry his brother's widow, Catherine. Henry wasn't exactly keen on the idea and rejected it when he turned 14. In April 1509, the old king died and the 17-year-old prince ascended to the throne and became Henry VIII. Towards the end of his reign, Henry VII had become a miserly, miserable king. It's likely this was compounded by the fact that his wife, the Queen, had passed away just a year after his son Arthur had died. He had raised taxes and had even banned Henry from one of his favourite pursuits, jousting. Understandably, such a deadly sport was too much to risk for a future king. So when Henry VIII finally ascended to the throne, he was embraced as an exciting change by the royal court and the whole kingdom. One of Henry's first acts was to change his mind about marrying Catherine of Aragon. Even though she was 6 years his senior, and Henry was initially repulsed by the idea of marrying his brother's widow, over the years he'd fallen in love with her. Pope Julius II granted him a favour by accepting Henry's argument, not a hint of irony here, that Catherine had remained a virgin throughout her 7 months of marriage to Arthur. Consequently, the pair were joined in union just months after he became king. They would stay married for almost 24 years. Well, as mentioned, Henry spent around 24 years married to Catherine of Aragon. Despite his dreams of a strong male heir, this never came about with her. In the first 5 years of their marriage, Catherine had carried 4 babies, 3 sons and a daughter, all of which had sadly miscarried or died. Then, in 1516, another daughter was born, one that would live, Mary, the future queen. Henry was 25, and there would be no more children with Catherine. In about 1525, when he was in his early 30s, Henry apparently became infatuated with one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting, one Anne Boleyn. He'd already been conducting an affair with Anne's sister, Mary. In fact, he'd conducted multiple affairs, and actually at this stage already had a son, a strapping, healthy boy called, well, Henry, obviously. Unfortunately, Henry's mother was simply one of the king's conquests, so he was illegitimate and couldn't succeed his father. Anyway, it's possible he viewed Anne as just another conquest. Instead, Anne remained out of reach and resisted the king's efforts. Partly dissatisfied with Catherine of Aragon's inability to produce a male heir, Henry became consumed with a desire to marry Anne. The king devised a simple plan: divorce Catherine, marry Anne, produce a son and heir, and live happily ever after. So, that's just what happened. Only joking. The Pope totally said no. Henry's old pal, Julius II, had died in 1513. The new Pope, Clement VII, refused to give Henry a divorce, and the whole plan was, well, totally screwed. The Pope needed to be seen as strong, not bending to Henry VIII's will. In addition, Catherine of Aragon's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, had sacked Rome in 1527, placing the Pope under house arrest, and more or less controlling him. There was no way he was going to allow the Pope to let his aunt be humiliated by being cast aside. But Henry VIII didn't give up. Remember how at the start of his reign he was arguing that it didn't matter that Catherine had married his older brother? Well, 20 years on, he suddenly now declared that because Catherine had previously been married to his brother Arthur, the marriage was an abomination in the eyes of the Lord. As stated in the Bible, in Leviticus 21, if a man marries a brother's wife, it is an act of impurity. He has dishonoured his brother. They will be childless. The marriage, Henry said, was therefore null and void. But Rome wouldn't be moved. Henry had decided to have his way, and used Parliament to assert his authority over the English Church. New laws allowed the Archbishop of Canterbury to annul the marriage without consulting the Pope. He married Anne Boleyn in 1533, and she was declared Queen Consort, and soon afterwards the king was delighted when Anne gave birth. A beautiful daughter. Yes, daughter, the future Queen Elizabeth I. The Pope, of course, wasn't going to sit back quietly, and unless he took Catherine back as his wife, Henry would be excommunicated. Henry's response? In 1534, the Act of Supremacy formally abolished papal authority in England, and Henry was declared the head of the new Church of England. But Henry was a king and drew his power directly from God. Not everyone in the kingdom was signed up to abandoning Catholicism in favour of, a completely new religious direction. Though some elements of the Catholic faith were retained, many people rejected newer elements, like the introduction of a Bible in English. Over the years, many of these dissenters, the ones who put their fear of offending God ahead of their fear of the king, and many others were killed in some very brutal ways. The number put to death under Henry VIII is thought to be anywhere between 50 and 72,000. The main thing was that Henry got to remarry, and he was happy, right? Well, not so fast. You see, things may have looked up for the new royal couple initially, but it didn't last long. Anne's temper and personality rubbed Henry's courtiers up the wrong way, and she made many enemies. And soon enough, the marriage was also on the rocks. Incredible though it seems, in January 1536, Anne was pregnant with Henry's second child, perhaps the son he'd long hoped for. 4 months later, though, she would be dead, beheaded on her husband's orders. Henry appears to have become bored by Anne, and had fallen for one of her ladies-in-waiting, this time Jane Seymour. The dramatic events of 1536 unfolded when Henry was thrown from his horse, knocked unconscious, and badly injured. In shock, Anne had a miscarriage. Then, within weeks and out of nowhere, rumours were flying around that Anne had committed adultery. Henry and his courtiers seized their moment. 5 men, scandalously including her own brother George, were accused of having relations with her. The evidence was pretty flimsy, but justice was swift. All 5 were executed. About 2 days later, Anne was led to the execution block and killed. The king wasn't a complete monster, though. He kindly drafted in an expert swordsman from France to ensure her head was taken off quickly and efficiently. The king didn't spend much time mourning for his poor lost wife. In fact, the day after her execution, he became engaged to Jane Seymour, and the pair were married 10 days later. The next year, Jane gave birth to the son Henry had always longed for, a boy named Edward, who would succeed him. Days after giving birth, however, Jane suffered complications and died. Now that he had a son who would succeed him, he generously struck laws declaring his daughters Mary and Elizabeth illegitimate off the books, something which would, in effect, one day allow them to ascend to the throne of England. Despite his best efforts to act like a grief-stricken husband following Jane's death, it wasn't long before he was on the lookout for wife number 4. Seeking allies in Europe who would support his decision to abolish papal authority, Henry's advisor Thomas Cromwell suggested Anne of Cleves. Anne was the daughter of the German Duke of Cleves, where Lutheranism was starting to flourish. The artist Hans Holbein was dispatched to paint a picture of Anne for the king to view. In a kind of pre-internet version of Tinder, the king liked what he saw. He swiped right, and a marriage was arranged. And much like Tinder, when the king finally met his bride-to-be in person, she looked nothing like her portrait, or so he claimed. Nevertheless, Henry decided he would do what any self-respecting Englishman would do in this situation. He would avoid any embarrassing unpleasantness in the moment and clean up the resulting mess afterwards. He married Anne in January 1540, didn't consecrate the marriage, divorced her in the July, courted and married another of Anne Boleyn's former ladies-in-waiting, this time the 17-year-old Catherine Howard, and married her. Oh, and just for good measure, he had Cromwell beheaded on his wedding day. Catherine didn't last long, though. She was reportedly discovered having an affair behind the king's back. Just like Anne Boleyn, she was arrested, tried and executed around 19 months after her marriage to the king. After that, the king had had enough. He already had a son, he had 2 daughters, and he decided that at the age of 51, it was best to retire with dignity. Only kidding, this is Henry VIII we're talking about. In July 1543, he married his sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr. It's thought Catherine didn't really want to marry the king, but what choice did she have? Catherine is credited with encouraging Henry to repair his relationship with Mary and Elizabeth. At this point, the king's health was already in decline. He was grossly overweight and had to be moved around with Tudor-era mechanical devices. In January 1547, the king, leaving a trail of religious and marital destruction behind him, died.